In the late 1800s, ranchers in northern Mexico rode the ridges with their herds, guarding against coyotes and cats. But when goats began turning up dead, blood drained, bodies untouched, their search led them to a scarred mesquite tree and caves whispered about for generations. Inside, they found signs no animal should leave, and when night fell, something began to follow. To this day, the men swore the sound of clicking in the dark was not meant for animals at all. So, before we continue, please make sure to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I was 20 when goats started dying along our northern pasture. My brother Raul woke me before dawn, and we left the cook fire with stale coffee in our mouths and cold iron in our hands. The sky held a gray band over the mesas. Our horses breathed steam, and the grass was short and stiff. We rode with Don Enzo, who owned the ranch, and two hands, Mateo and Luis. The dogs stayed behind on a rope because the night before they had frozen at the fence and would not cross. We followed the arroyo east where the limestone broke into ledges and short cliffs. We meant to find whatever was killing the herd and end it fast because the season was lean and our fences needed repairs. The first carcass lay under a cluster of prickly pear. Its body was stiff, the hide unbroken except for two small holes high on the neck. There was little blood on the ground. Raul crouched and pressed 2 fingers above the shoulder. The skin felt cold. He looked up and met my eyes. I bent to check the tracks. The dirt was smooth. No drag marks, no coyote prints, nothing from a cat. The goats had run in a tight circle and then stopped. Flies were late and few, which I noted and did not say out loud. Mateo crossed himself and said the old name for a thing that steals from corrals and leaves no trail. He said there were caves ahead on the south face where the stone folded in on itself. The vaqueros on his father's place had kept away from those folds. They left offerings at a mesquite with a scarred trunk. He told us the tree still stood. I watched the wind push dust along the arroyo bed and said we should keep moving. We found a second goat near a dry seep. The same punctures, the same clean ground. Luis spoke too fast and then stopped. He was new, and he wanted to prove himself, so he offered to ride ahead. Don Enzo told him to keep his horse in line. He took off his hat, wiped his brow, and said we would check the north slope before the heat climbed. He kept his voice even. I knew he felt the same thinness in the air that I felt. It was not silence. It was the way sound carried and then fell short, the way hooves struck the ground without echo under certain ledges. I marked the land by these changes. I had ridden it since childhood, and when a place felt wrong, I could tell it before my mouth formed the words. We cut north under the ridge. The limestone showed white edges where flash floods had chewed out new runs. A black vulture stood on a fence post and watched us pass. It did not lift its wings. Farther on, we reached the scarred mesquite. Ribbons of cloth hung from one branch. Dried corn lay in a small clay bowl at the base, split by weather. Someone had left a strip of goat hide pinned to a thorn. It had hardened and curled. Mateo said his father had taught him to hang small food at the border of bad ground when cattle grew skittish without cause. He said the cave mouths started 200 steps beyond the tree. Raul looked at me, then looked at the cloth and said we were not turning back because of old talk. We tied the horses under a rock overhang where they could rest in the shade. They stood quiet at first. After a few minutes, the bay gelding started to toss its head. The dun rolled an eye and stamped. Raul checked their girths and spoke low to them. The smell in the air shifted. It was a sharp, stale odor, not from rot and not from urine. I had never smelled it on any hunt. It reminded me of a bucket of blood left in the sun and then cooled, metallic and heavy without a sour edge. I kept the thought to myself and shouldered my rifle. The first cave mouth was narrow, just wide enough for a grown man to pass with his shoulders turned. The stone around it was smooth where water had run for years, then rough where it had broken free. We found no droppings and no owl pellets. We found no sign of bats. A scatter of small bones lay near the entrance, clean and light, mostly birds. A few rodents, one goat kid skull no bigger than my palm. The bones were not chewed. Some had neat punctures that had marked the thin plates and left them cracked without splinters. Luis swallowed and asked who carried the lanterns. We had 2 old tin ones with fresh oil and a bundle of cedar kindling. I gave one lantern to Mateo and kept one. Raul checked his revolver and nodded at me. We did not enter yet. We walked the line of the ridge to mark every opening. We counted 9 mouths along that face, some as small as a boot heel, one large enough for a wagon if the ground had allowed it. The large mouth sat under a tilted shelf of stone. The air that moved out of it felt cool and dry. A goat trail skirted past and dropped into the arroyo. The ground around the mouth held a crust that broke into powder under a boot. Don Enzo knelt and ran his hand across the crust. He held up a flake to the lantern. It caught the light with a faint gloss. He said it looked like dried albumin from old blood. He did not claim it. He only placed the flake back on the ground and stood. As we walked, small details pressed at the edges of my attention. A lizard lay dead on a flat rock with no wound. A line of ants had crossed it and then turned back, leaving a gap in their path. A cicada shell hung from a blade of grass near the cave and crumbled when the breeze touched it. None of these facts stood alone. Together they said the same thing the goats had said when they circled and froze. The land was holding itself differently around those mouths, and the animals had learned it. I wanted to tell Raoul in a way that would not sound like fear. I said, plainly, we should start at the smallest hole and work up, and we should mark our path with cord and chalk. He agreed at once, which told me he felt it too. We lit the lanterns. The oil woke, the wicks drew, and the light stood steady. The sun climbed over the ridge and laid heat on the open ground. We moved back to the narrowest opening. Mateo took the chalk, made a mark on the right side of the entrance, and tied cord to a rock outside. He fed the line in as I crawled. The passage ran 3 body lengths and opened into a pocket no larger than a water tank. The air inside held the same stale edge. I held the lantern high and turned slowly. The walls bore fine scratches in clustered groups, pairs and trios, always at the same height above the floor. They were not claw marks from a cat. They were close together and straight. I traced one set with a finger. The stone felt dry and cold. I called back that there was nothing alive. Raoul said to come out. I backed out, careful not to scrape the glass on the stone. We moved to the next hole. It ran only 2 paces and ended in a plug of fallen rock. We marked it and kept going. The 5th opening ran deep at a slope. We set a second cord, tied to a second rock, and stepped down one at a time. Our boots rang on hard floor. The light picked out small piles of pellets in one corner. They were not from goats and not from rabbits. They were too regular, not like any droppings I had seen. Each pellet had a faint dark center. I did not touch them. The room held a sour trace that stung my throat when I breathed through my mouth. We listened. The sound in there was a low movement, not wind, not water. It was the shuffle of air through channels we could not see. It came and went without pattern. When we came out, the horses had pulled their reins tight. Foam stood at the bay's bit. Luis went to them and stroked their necks until the sweat lay flat again. He looked at me and then down at the ground. He wanted to say he was ready to leave. He did not say it. He picked up the coil of cord and asked where next. His voice had steadied. That was good. Fear that goes quiet can hold a line. Panic that speaks keeps speaking. We reached the large mouth near midday. The heat on my back met the cool air from the dark and set a hard edge across my skin. I held the lantern forward and saw the stone drop into a wide room. The floor showed marks, shallow and many. They crossed and layered and pointed toward the deeper tunnels. They were not boot marks. They were not hoof marks. They were small and paired, repeated in measured steps. I felt my chest tighten. Raoul said to wait. He walked back to the mesquite and returned with the clay bowl and the strip of hide. He set them at the side of the entrance on the ground. He did it without ceremony, only with care. He said nothing while he set them down. When he finished, he looked at me and nodded once. I nodded back. We ate dry meat and cold tortillas under the overhang. No one said much. Don Enzo unfolded a paper map of the property and laid a small stone on each corner. He drew 9 small crosses where the mouths ran and circled the largest. He said we would go in no more than 2 rooms deep in any tunnel, and only farther in the big one because it gave us space to stand and turn. If we found a den, we would test fire and smoke before we did anything rash. Mateo said he would carry the cedar and a tin of oil. Luis checked his belt knife, sheathed it, and drank water. Raoul loosened his shoulder and rolled his wrists the way he did before breaking a colt. He glanced at me once as if to measure how steady my eyes were. I held his gaze and held it steady. We rose and walked to the large mouth. The air that came from inside carried that same metallic trace and another layer I had not caught before, a faint sweet note that turned bitter a moment later. I lifted the lantern and saw the first room open ahead with 3 exit tunnels at the far wall. The ceiling hung low near the middle and rose at the sides. The floor tilted slightly down toward the right. I told them to watch the tilt. They nodded. We stepped inside and let the light move over the stone. We stood silent and listened for anything that breathed. The only sound was that slow, irregular movement of air through passages beyond our sight. We walked forward in a careful line, and the light reached the far wall. That was when I saw, at knee height near the right tunnel, a smear of fresh wetness on the stone, thin and dark, with 2 neat holes above it. I felt my jaw set. I raised a hand to stop the line. We had found where the trail led. Raoul moved up beside me and steadied the lantern with his palm under mine. Mateo set the cedar bundle down near the entrance and kept the oil tin in his pocket. Don Enzo crouched by the smear and studied the 2 holes above it without touching them. He raised his eyes to me, and then to the right-hand tunnel. His look asked a simple question. I nodded. He told Luis to pay out the second cord. Mateo marked the wall with chalk, 3 short strokes on the right. We stepped into the right tunnel in single file. The air cooled further. The floor tilted more. The lantern flame stood steady, which meant there was not much airflow here. The stone on the walls bore the same grouped scratches at a fixed height. I noted that they were fresh in some places and old in others, and the old ones had a faint powder in them that came off on the tip of my finger. We moved 20 paces and reached a bend that hid what lay beyond. I lifted my hand to stop the line. We listened. There was a soft movement ahead, not steady, not rhythmic, short and spaced. We rounded the bend. The tunnel opened into a low room, no taller than a man. The floor held a litter of broken bones in small pieces, more bird and rodent than goat. At the far wall lay a fresh goat kid, intact, eyes open, body still flexible, 2 neat punctures on the neck. There was no pool. Raul checked the flank with 2 fingers. He drew his hand back and shook his head once. Mateo swallowed and said nothing. Luis set the cord length over a rock and kept the slack ready. Don Enzo moved his lantern slowly along the floor. The small pieces of bone had been arranged in thin arcs near the wall. He nudged one with his boot. It rolled but held the curve. He did not push further. We stood in that room long enough for the air to feel stale. I wanted to test smoke here to see how it moved. Mateo opened the oil tin and wet a strip of cedar, then twisted it tight. I lit it from the lantern and held it near the floor, then at shoulder height. The smoke rose, drifted toward the left side of the room, and slipped into a narrow seam I had not noticed. I set the cedar on the ground. The smoke thinned and vanished into the seam. The seam was no wider than 2 fingers, but it ran upward and toward the back of the cave. Raul pointed at it. We marked the seam with chalk for later and backed out. I did not want to wedge hands into a place I could not see. We returned to the first large room and took the middle exit. The floor in that tunnel showed more of the paired steps. They overlapped and led inward. I began to see where the pairs spread for a moment and then came together again, as if the stride had changed on uneven rock. The tunnel sloped down in a shallow grade. The smell shifted to that faint sweet note that had turned bitter near the entrance. It was stronger here and more complex. I placed it somewhere between dried blood and a plant resin with a hard edge. Mateo wiped his forearm across his face. I felt sweat gather beneath my shirt despite the cool air. The middle tunnel opened into a high chamber with a flat floor. The ceiling lifted enough that we could stand without bending. There were 3 alcoves cut into the far wall, evenly spaced, each one deep enough to hold a man. In the first alcove lay a set of bones that were not from a goat or a rabbit. They were long, with joint shapes I had seen only on cats and dogs. The skull in that alcove had flat teeth in front and pointed teeth farther back, worn and chipped, with 2 small round holes through the thin bone near the base. In the second alcove lay woven grass, dry and gray, arranged in a shallow bowl. The grass had been braided into bands and then crossed to make a base. It was not the work of wind or water. In the third alcove lay a pile of thin hides, not tanned, dried hard, cut into strips of equal width. Each strip had small punctures in a row near one end, as if something had run a tool through it for fastening. Luis stood at the edge of the lantern light and did not enter the alcoves. His right hand rested on his belt knife. His jaw worked. He had stopped speaking, and that was fine with me. Don Enzo knelt near the woven base and inspected it without touching. He kept his hands on his knees. He took in the braid pattern and the way it had been crossed. He looked at me and said in a low voice that a person had done this or something with hands. He did not ask a question. He stated a fact. I nodded once. Raul stepped closer to the strips of hide and counted them. There were 9 strips, each the length of a man's forearm, each pierced at the same interval. He stepped back again. Mateo spoke then, finally. He said his father had told him about caves where a thing gathered tools the way a person gathers tools. He had not believed him. We searched the rest of the chamber. The floor near the center had shallow depressions in a rough ring. They were not footprints in the way we knew footprints. They were areas where the stone had been polished to a dull sheen, round and shallow, the size of a man's palm. At the edge of the ring stood 3 short stone stacks, 6 stones each, balanced without mortar. We did not touch them. The lantern light made the edges hard. I stepped around them and kept my breath even. A new sound came then, from the passage opposite the way we had entered. It was a short exhalation, followed by a dry rasp that stopped. The sound came again, then moved. I raised the rifle and held the lantern out to the side to keep the glare from my eyes. Raul lifted his revolver. Mateo set the oil tin down and took hold of the cedar bundle with both hands. Luis kept the cord taut without pulling hard. Don Enzo moved 2 steps to his left to clear a line for his shotgun. We stood in a shallow arc. The shape appeared at the far edge of the light, low and narrow, gray on gray. It held still and watched us. Eyes reflected the lantern. They were set wide apart. The head was wedge-shaped, not broad. There was a ridge of hard nubs along the back that ran from the neck to the hips. The front limbs were longer than the rear, with joints that bent in a way that put the weight forward. The paws ended in 2 main claws with a smaller inner one. The mouth was narrow, with small pointed teeth close together. When it moved, it did not scrape stone. It placed each paw and lifted it. It stopped at the edge of the ring of polished stone and lowered its head. The smell grew stronger. The sweet note bit at the back of my throat. Luis exhaled through his nose. The sound broke the stillness. The thing lifted its head and drew air through its mouth. The lips pulled back without a snarl. No sound followed, only the movement of breath. I heard the leather creak on Raul's holster. He did not fire. He waited for Don Enzo. The pause held. The thing took one step to the left, then right, then forward one pace. It did not enter the ring. It stayed at the edge. It turned its head toward the third alcove with the hide strips and then back to us. It lowered its head again and held still. I spoke in a low voice. I said we would back toward the entrance to the chamber and not break the line. I said we would not show the backs of our heads. I said we would keep the lantern between it and us. Don Enzo agreed with a single word. We stepped back one pace at a time. The thing followed our movement by turning its head. It did not step forward. When we reached the mouth of the tunnel we had used to enter, it moved 2 paces toward the center of the chamber, just to the edge of the ring. It lowered its head and exhaled. I smelled that bitter trace again. It turned and moved to the third alcove. It took one strip of hide in its front claws with a quick grip and set the strip across its forelimbs. It held still for 3 breaths. Then it turned its head toward us again. We did not fire. We moved into the tunnel and walked backward until the chamber narrowed into the passage. When we reached the bend, we turned and moved faster. The cord slid through Luis's hands. The chalk marks on the wall passed in a rhythm that steadied my breathing. At the last turn before the first chamber, I heard a new sound from behind. It was not breath. It was a light tapping, spaced evenly. 2 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause. Raul looked at me. I looked at Don Enzo. He nodded. We did not run. We reached the first chamber and faced the 3 exit tunnels. The tapping stopped. We gathered at the center and took a quick count. Everyone was there. I said we would fall back to the mouth and take stock. As we crossed the large room, my boot slid on the crust near the entrance. I caught myself and looked down. The crust had fresh marks in it, pairs, the same spacing as in the tunnels, leading not into the cave, but toward the outside. I raised my lantern and held it to the mouth. The daylight made a shallow line on the floor. The marks went to that line and stopped. We stepped into the open air, one by one, with the lanterns shielded from the sun. The horses stood with heads high and ears forward. Their reins were taut. The bay's chest heaved. Luis went to them again and spoke. The dun struck once and settled. I checked the sky and the line of the ridge. The day had moved on. The shadow had shifted across the arroyo. I looked back into the mouth. The cool air still moved out. The smell reached only to the edge. We pulled back to the overhang and set the lanterns down on flat rock. No one spoke for several breaths. Then Don Enzo said plain that we had seen enough to call this more than coyotes or cats. He said we would not leave the herd here to be taken. He said we would try to seal the main entrance by nightfall and mark the smaller mouths for later. Mateo said we could build a fire at the mouth and test smoke. Raul said the seam in the first side chamber had drawn smoke, which meant there was a network deeper in that we did not understand. Luis asked whether one thing had made those marks or more than one. I looked at the paired steps in the crust and thought about the strips of hide and the woven base. I said I had not seen more than one at a time, but the arrangement in the chamber had not been made in one night. We agreed to gather brush and dry wood from the arroyo and feed a slow, oily fire at the mouth to carry smoke inward. We would watch for exits. We would tie fresh cord across each smaller opening to see if anything broke it. We would keep 2 men on the horses to steady them and to ride if anything came out. We moved at once. We did not leave anyone alone. We worked fast without raising our voices. The sun stood high but would not hold long. I felt the hours narrowing and the tasks growing. I kept my hands busy and my mind on each step. The goats in the north pasture would not survive another night of this. We cut mesquite and juniper branches from the arroyo floor, stripping them down to dry lengths. Mateo broke the brush into smaller pieces for kindling while Raul gathered heavier limbs. Luis kept glancing at the ridge. He said nothing, but every time his head turned, his hand stayed near the knife on his belt. Don Enzo bound the branches into 2 bundles with cord, and we carried them up to the large mouth. The air pushing out of the cave remained steady, cool against the heat of the day. The smell clung there, sharper now, as if the earlier encounter had stirred something inside. We laid the brush in a low heap across the entrance and poured oil along the base. Mateo struck flint until sparks caught the cedar kindling. He fed the flame carefully, guiding it under the brush until it spread. The fire took quick, low, and dark. Thick smoke coiled and pressed inward against the draft. We stood in silence as it rolled into the dark. The horses down below grew restless again, tossing their heads and snorting. Luis called out that they were pulling hard at the reins. Don Enzo sent him back to settle them, and Raul went too. The 2 men stood at their sides, speaking low, while the fire smoldered on. At first, the smoke slid inward without change. Then it slowed, and I watched as the flow shifted and began to push back toward us. A faint draft, like a slow breath from within, forced the smoke outward. The fire burned lower under the weight of that push. Mateo threw on more cedar, and the flames rose, but the smoke still met resistance. It spread across the mouth, circled, and hung low. Don Enzo's jaw set hard. He said the chambers inside were breathing against us. A sharp noise broke through the air, a dry click echoing from inside the stone. It came in pairs, measured, like the tapping we had heard before, but louder now. Raúl and Luis looked up from the horses. The sound repeated, closer, then stopped. The smoke at the mouth shifted again, pulled back suddenly into the dark. The draft drew hard inward, as if something had opened a throat deep inside. The fire crackled, sparks rushed forward, and the heap leaned toward the cave. Don Enzo raised his shotgun and stepped forward. I lifted the rifle beside him. We stood tight at the edge, waiting for movement. The air stilled, the smoke thinned, nothing came out. We did not lower our arms. The quiet held too long. Then the bay gelding screamed and reared, snapping its rein against the overhang. Raúl shouted and pulled it down, barely holding the line. Luis pointed past the arroyo. Across the slope near one of the smaller mouths we had marked with chalk, the cord tied across the opening sagged. It had been cut clean. No fray, no strain, only severed. We ran to it together, leaving Mateo to keep the fire alive at the large entrance. When we reached the opening, the cord lay on the ground in two halves. The chalk mark on the stone bore a new scratch through it, fresh and pale. The tunnel inside was dark. The air carried that same sweet metallic odor. Raúl crouched low, studying the cut. He said it was not chewed. The ends were too clean. He held the two pieces up. They looked as if sliced by a sharp tool. Don Enzo said nothing for a long moment. Then he told us flat we would not wait for night to close around us. We would try to seal every opening with stone and brush now, before anything else stepped through. He gave orders quick and firm. Mateo would keep feeding the fire at the main entrance. Raúl and I would carry stones from the arroyo to the smaller mouths. Luis would keep with the horses, ready to ride if something broke through. Don Enzo would move between us, watching all lines. We worked fast. The sun beat down hard, sweat running into our eyes. We hauled flat stones and stacked them against the narrow mouths, filling gaps with brush and earth. The smoke at the large entrance thickened again, drifting out in puffs that hung low across the ground. Mateo coughed but did not step back. He threw in more cedar and kept the flame hot. When we sealed the third small mouth, Raúl wiped his brow and muttered that it felt like piling sticks against a flood. His voice carried strain but not doubt. I told him plain we had to keep trying. Half an hour passed before the first stone wall collapsed. A crash sounded from the far end of the ridge where we had blocked one of the tighter openings. Dust lifted into the air and a section of stacked rock rolled down the slope. We ran to it. The brush we had wedged in had been pushed from inside. It lay scattered downhill. Among it we found 2 strips of goat hide, fresh and wet, laid neatly across the stones. Luis swore under his breath and gripped his reins tighter. His horse turned in circles, foam on its lips. Don Enzo stared at the strips and then turned to all of us. He said we were wasting strength trying to hold the ridge. He said the thing, or things, knew every turn of the tunnels. They would come out where we least expected. He said our work was only marking ourselves for them. He ordered us to pull the horses and move the herd south by nightfall, away from this ground entirely. His tone left no space for argument. Raúl looked like he wanted to speak but closed his mouth. Mateo doused the fire with earth, though smoke still seeped from the stones. The mouths along the ridge exhaled faint wisps, carrying that bitter-sweet odor stronger than before. We loaded what we could onto the horses, tied off the rest, and began leading them down the arroyo. The sun tilted low, shadows stretching across the scrub. The goats in the northern pasture bleated faintly in the distance, restless, as if they felt the air shift. The ridge behind us stayed quiet, but the weight of eyes pressed on our backs. I walked at the rear, rifle in hand, turning often to check the slope. Each time I looked, the mouths seemed darker, wider, as if the stone itself was watching. We did not speak much as we moved. Our boots scuffed dust into the dry air. The herd bleated and pushed against each other, nerves running through them. I thought of the bones in the alcove, the woven grass, the strips of hide pierced for fastening. I thought of the tapping, the measured breath, the way it had held back at the ring of polished stone. My jaw clenched. We were leaving, but I knew it was not finished with us. We would be watched, perhaps followed, and perhaps tested again once the dark came. The first stars appeared faint above the ridge as we drove the goats south. By the time the herd reached the southern pasture, the sky had gone deep blue and the first bats wheeled overhead. We penned the goats inside a crude corral of split cedar, the animals pressed together, uneasy, their eyes catching the lantern light with a dull sheen. Luis tied the last gate shut and leaned against the post, his breath short. Raúl and I unrolled blankets near the fence, rifles within reach. Mateo built a low fire, stacking mesquite branches so it would burn slow through the night. Don Enzo walked the perimeter, his shotgun balanced in his arm, each step deliberate. We ate little: dry beans, a strip of meat each, and water from the skin. The air hung heavy with the smell of smoke clinging to our clothes. My ears kept searching for sound beyond the herd: coyotes, owls, anything. But the night gave back only the shifting of hooves and the creak of wood. Luis muttered that he could not shake the feeling we had carried something back with us. He said the horses still pulled at their ropes, heads turning toward the ridge, though we were far from it now. Raul told him to keep quiet and save his voice for when it mattered. Still, his own eyes never left the dark line of hills to the north. Near midnight, the goats stirred in unison, their bleats sharp and panicked. They pressed so hard against one side of the corral that the posts groaned. Raul and I ran to steady them, pushing them back with the butts of our rifles. I heard the sound then, a faint click, 2 beats and a pause, carrying across the open land. It came again, closer, and the goats screamed louder. Mateo threw brush on the fire, and the flames leapt higher, casting shadows wide. Don Enzo raised his hand for silence. We all froze, listening. The clicking stopped. In its place came a thin whistle, almost like air squeezed through a reed, wavering and short. The herd went silent as if holding breath. The fire cracked once, then the whistle cut off. The quiet that followed felt like a hand pressing against the ears. Don Enzo whispered that we would hold the line until dawn. He ordered 2 men awake at all times, one near the herd, one near the horses. Raul and I took the first watch. Luis curled on his blanket, though I doubted he slept. I walked the fence slow, lantern held low. The goat's eyes followed me, glinting. Beyond the corral, the land stretched open, low grass and scattered mesquite, the ridge a black shadow against the horizon. Nothing moved there. Still, I could not shake the sense of weight watching from that direction. Raul sat with his back to the fire, revolver resting on his knee, eyes on the dark. He said nothing until I circled back, then he spoke, voice flat. He said he had seen the hide strips in his sleep once before when we were children and his fever had taken him. He said he had woken with marks on his arm that looked like punctures. He never told anyone. He stared out again and ended it there. An hour passed. The fire burned low, the air cooling. I rubbed my hands and bent to add more brush when I heard it. A scrape of stone on stone, far off, steady, drawn out. Raul heard it too. We raised our weapons and turned our eyes north. The sound came again, closer. The goats pressed back from the fence. Don Enzo rose from his blanket and joined us, shotgun ready. Mateo grabbed the oil tin and poured it into the fire. Flames surged, lighting the pasture bright. For a moment, nothing showed. Then, along the slope of the ridge, 3 shapes broke from the mouth of the largest cave. They moved low to the ground, bodies narrow, ridges along their backs, forelimbs long and heavy. Their eyes caught the firelight from far away. Luis woke with a gasp. He stumbled to his feet, knife shaking in his hand. Raul whispered for him to stay steady. The shapes did not charge. They paced the ridge, clicking, the sound carrying like wood striking together. One stopped and lowered its head toward us, then turned aside. Another crouched, claws gripping the stone. The third lifted something in its forelimbs. It caught the firelight, a strip of hide, long, swaying. It hung it across its limbs as the one in the chamber had done. Then all 3 vanished back into the dark, swift and silent. The herd burst into noise again, bleating and kicking. We pressed them back until the corral held. My chest thudded with each breath. Don Enzo spoke at last. He said plain we could not outwait them. If they were showing themselves now, they wanted us to know. He told us at dawn we would drive the herd farther south, past the river, even if the land there was poor. He said this was no ground for men or animals. We kept our watch until the first light touched the east. The goats sagged with exhaustion, and so did we. None of us spoke of the 3 shapes once the sun rose, but we all carried it in our eyes. We broke camp quickly, packed our things, and drove the herd south. The land opened wide, the river glimmering faint in the distance. The farther we moved, the easier the goats walked. Their cries softened, the horses steadied, the smell that had clung to us faded from the air. Still, when I turned to look back, the ridge sat black against the sky, silent and waiting. I knew we had not escaped it. We had only moved beyond its reach for a time. By midday, we reached the river. Its water ran shallow and brown, but it marked a line between pastures. Don Enzo chose a rise above the far bank for the herd, a stretch of grass thin but safe. The goats settled faster than I expected, lowering their heads to graze. Their bleats softened to normal sounds. The horses drank deep from the river and stood calmer. For the first time in days, the air felt open, without that bittersweet trace. I wanted to believe distance was enough, yet every time I closed my eyes I saw those shapes on the ridge, the way one had lifted the strip of hide like it meant to show us something. We built a new fire on the rise. Mateo fetched more wood from the brush near the river. Luis tended the herd, checking hooves and fence lines. Raul and I filled canteens at the water, our eyes never straying far from the northern horizon. Don Enzo sat on a flat stone and studied his map, tracing a line south with his thumb. He said we would keep moving the herd in stages until we reached his cousin's land near San Juan, far beyond the hills. He spoke low, but his voice carried certainty. He would not risk losing the ranch to whatever lived in those caves. Through the afternoon, the land stayed quiet. We took turns resting, though none of us slept well. Each time I drifted, a sound in the grass pulled me up, a lizard's tail, a locust wing, a goat's sudden call. Raul stayed restless too. He sat sharpening his knife until the edge gleamed. At one point, he said almost to himself that he had felt something brush his leg when we left the ridge. Not claw or tooth, just a weight, like a hand steadying itself. He looked at me, then shook his head as if the words should not have left his mouth. Toward evening, clouds rolled in from the west. The light grew dim and the air heavy. A storm gathered. We worked fast to stake the herd inside a makeshift corral with cut branches. Thunder rolled low across the sky. Rain fell in sheets, drenching the ground, running in rivulets toward the river. The goats huddled together. The horses pulled their reins but did not panic. I lifted my face to the rain, grateful to smell only wet earth. Yet under it, faint and sharp, the old trace returned. My stomach tightened. I told Raul I caught it, and he nodded without hesitation. He smelled it too. That night we kept the fire high despite the rain, feeding it with whatever dry wood we had covered. The herd bleated off and on, disturbed by the storm. The thunder masked smaller sounds, but now and then, between rumbles, I heard clicks, soft at first, then sharper. They came from across the river, on the near bank we had left behind. I raised the lantern high and saw nothing but dripping mesquite. Still the clicking went on, 2 beats and a pause, again and again, steady as footsteps. Luis swore under his breath and gripped his knife. Mateo asked if we should fire a shot to warn them off. Don Enzo shook his head. He said we would not waste powder shooting at shadows. The storm eased near midnight. Mist rose from the wet ground, curling low over the pasture. The firelight threw our shadows long. Raul and I stood guard along the corral. My eyes traced the line of the mist until I saw movement, low, deliberate, slipping through the grass beyond the river. One shape at first, then another, then 2 more. They did not cross the water. They stayed on the far bank, pacing, watching. Their eyes caught the fire, reflecting pale green. One crouched and tapped its claws against stone, the sound carrying across the water like a drum. The others froze and lowered their heads, as if listening. Then they all rose and vanished into the mist, silent as before. When dawn broke the next morning, the herd was still intact. No goat was lost. Relief spread through the men, though no one smiled. We broke camp at once and drove the herd farther south. The land stretched wide and flat now, safer ground, but unease clung to us. Each mile put more distance between us and the ridge, yet every turn of my head I expected to see those shapes pacing behind us. For 3 days we traveled. The goats grew calmer. The horses returned to their normal gait. Luis even laughed once when one of the kids butted him in the leg. I wanted to believe we had outrun it. But the 4th night, as we camped under a stand of cottonwoods, I woke to find Raul sitting upright, eyes on the dark. I asked him what stirred him. He said he had dreamed of the alcove again, the woven grass, the strips of hide. Only this time the strips were laid across his chest like a yoke. He swore he felt the weight when he woke. He pressed his hand to his shirt as he spoke. His skin was damp, not from sweat, but from something colder. He did not speak again until morning. At sunrise, we moved on. The land ahead promised better pasture, safe ground far from the caves. Yet the knowledge settled in all of us. We had seen what most men only spoke of in warnings and whispers. We had carried the herd away, but the caves still waited. And the things within them, whatever they were, had watched us leave without trying to stop us. They had let us go. That thought weighed heavier than any chase would have. We reached San Juan by the end of the week, the herd thinned from travel but alive. Don Enzo's cousin met us at the edge of his land, a weathered man named Arturo, who had heard rumors of our trouble even before we arrived. Word of dead goats had carried fast through the valley. He gave us water and salt and asked what we had seen. Don Enzo did not speak of the shapes or the hides. He only said the herd had been stalked by something not of wolf or cat, and that the caves in the ridge should not be entered. Arturo pressed him for more, but he cut him short. He said it was enough that we had escaped with most of the animals. We rested the herd on Arturo's land. The goats spread into the pasture, heads low, tails still stiff. Their ribs showed from the march. We washed in the river and mended tack. Mateo kept the fire burning at night, though Arturo said no need. Luis tied knots in cord until his fingers cramped. Raul worked his knife against a stone until the blade shone, his face set. I walked the edge of camp often, staring north though the ridge was hidden by distance. The smell was gone, but the memory clung. On the 2nd night, Arturo's hired hand, a boy no older than 16, came running into camp with his lantern shaking. He said he had been checking the goats at the lower field when he found 2 dead, each with neat punctures at the neck. Blood gone, bodies whole. His words tumbled over themselves. He swore he had heard clicks in the grass before he fled. We followed him at once, carrying our rifles and lanterns. The goats lay just as he said, stiff and pale, no tracks around them. Arturo swore hard and spat. He looked at Don Enzo with eyes full of anger and fear. He asked if we had brought this curse with us. Don Enzo answered steady. He said no, it had followed on its own. He told Arturo to move his herd farther south at once, even beyond San Juan if he could. Arturo argued, but Don Enzo's tone left no space. He said plain that no land was worth goats bled in silence. That night, none of us slept. We set torches around the camp. The fire burned high. The goats huddled tight, pressing each other until their bleats turned frantic. Around midnight, the sound came again. Clicks, 2 in a pause, circling the camp. First on one side, then another. I lifted my rifle, heart hammering. The night gave us no shape to fire at, only sound. Raul whispered that they were counting us. Luis cursed under his breath and gripped his knife with white knuckles. Mateo fed the fire until sparks climbed into the black sky. The circling went on for what felt like hours, then stopped all at once. The silence that followed was worse. The goats stilled, their heads all turned in the same direction, ears forward. I aimed there, my finger on the trigger. Nothing moved. The grass stood still. Then a faint whistle rose, wavering, the same sound from that first night near the ridge. It ended sharp. I thought of the woven grass, the ring of polished stone, the alcoves with bones. I knew we were not hearing beasts. We were hearing something that marked us. At dawn, we found 3 more goats dead, same punctures, same drained bodies, but this time inside the corral among the living. No sound had woken us, no struggle, no broken fence, just bodies laid neat on the ground. Arturo cursed us again, but his fear was greater than his anger. He loaded his family onto a wagon and drove them south before the sun rose high. He left his ranch untended. I watched the dust of his wheels fade and felt the weight of knowing this land was lost. Don Enzo gathered us then. He said the truth plain. These things would not stop at goats. They had shown patience, intelligence, even a kind of order. He said we could not fight them in the open, not with fire or stone, not with rifles. We could only warn others and move on. He looked at each of us in turn. Raul's jaw was tight, Mateo's eyes hollow, Luis pale and sweating. I felt the same weakness inside but forced my breath steady. We broke camp at once. We drove the herd farther south past the river into land few of us had seen. Each mile we left behind felt lighter, but none of us believed we had ended it. The caves still lay in the ridge, dark and breathing. The things within had followed us once, and they could again. They had let us live, as if it served them. That was the hardest truth to bear, that we had been measured and spared, not victorious. Weeks passed. The herd fattened in new pasture. Don Enzo sent word north that his land was closed, his fences left to rot. Men cursed his choice, but he did not bend. He said he would never put hoof or boot near those caves again. I rode the southern range often, checking fence lines, counting goats. The land there was bright and open, the air clean. Yet at night, when the fire sank low, I lay awake listening for clicks in the grass. I never heard them, but the waiting never left. I knew one day someone braver or more foolish would go back to that ridge. They would see the mesquite with the scarred trunk and the ribbons of cloth. They would walk past the chalk marks on stone, the cords cut clean, the bones in the alcove. They would hear the taps in the dark and the whistle that ends sharp. They would not turn back in time, and when they did not return, their names would become another warning whispered by ranch fires, another tale told to keep men from caves where goats die without blood. That was how I knew the story would not end with us.